The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders. Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Hesselmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Facultas Economie and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as With more than 65 years of experience as a prestigious educational institution in Indonesia, we have become one of the few that consistently produce the best graduates in the country. The development of FEBUI is not only limited in the standard degree education, but also in non-degree education, research, and consulting. Through cooperation, we always strive to provide benefits for both parties involved.
Hi, I'm Narumi Ishikawa from Japan Chiba University. Thank you for everything to expanding my knowledge. Thank you for Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Currently, there are plenty of FEBUI graduates who occupy key positions, both in the government and private companies, local and international. The Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia welcomes the entire academic community with open arms to achieve a bright and successful future together.
Part of FEBUI. Be part of FEBUI for a better future.
FEBUI, massive campus with great people and unique local food.
The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders.
And it runs
Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Esmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Fakultas Ekonomi and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as with more than 65 years of experience as a prestigious educational institution in Indonesia. We have become one of the few that consistently produce the best graduates in the country. The development of FEBUI is not only limited in the standard degree education, but also in non-degree education, research, and consulting. Through cooperation, we always strive to provide benefits for both parties involved.
Hi, I'm Narumi Ishikawa from Japan University. Thank you for FED to expanding my knowledge. Thank you for inviting Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Currently, there are plenty of FEBUI graduates who occupy key positions, both in the government and private companies, local and international. The Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia welcomes the entire academic community with open arms to achieve a bright and successful future together.
part of FEBUI. Be part of FEBUI for a better future.
FEBUI, massive campus with great people and unique local food.
The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders.
And it runs
Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Hesselmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Facultas Economie and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as With more than 65 years of experience as a prestigious educational institution in Indonesia, we have become one of the few that consistently produce the best graduates in the country. The development of FEBUI is not only limited in the standard degree education, but also in non-degree education, research, and consulting. Through cooperation, we always strive to provide benefits for both parties involved.
Hi, I'm Narumi Ishikawa from Japan Chiba University. Thank you for FEB to expanding my knowledge. Thank you for Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Currently, there are plenty of FEBUI graduates who occupy key positions, both in the government and private companies, local and international. The Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia welcomes the entire academic community with open arms to achieve a bright and successful future together.
Part of FEBUI. Be part of FEBUI for a better future.
FEBUI, massive campus with great people and unique local food.
The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders. Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Hesselmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Facultas Economy and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as
Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Dean Faculty of Economics and Business Universitas Indonesia, Mr. Teguh Dartanto, PhD. Chairman of PPIC International Affairs, Chairman of BSBI, Mr. Muhammad Edi Purnawan, PhD. Vice President Director of Bank Mandiri and Chairwoman Iluni FEBUI, Mrs. Alexandra Askandar. Vice Chairman of PPIC International Affairs, Mr. Taufan E.N. Roto Rasiko. Vice Dean for Education, Research and Student Affairs, Faculty of Economics and Business Universitas Indonesia, Mr. Arif Wibisono Lubis, PhD. Practice Manager Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment, World Bank East Asia and the Pacific, Mr. Lars Christian Moller. Senior Economist, World Bank Indonesia, Mr. Wael Mansur. World Bank Lead Economist for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Mr. Habib Rab. And respectable all the participants. My name is Doti, and it is an honor for me to be here as your Master of Ceremony. Welcome to the PPIC International Lecture Series 3, organized by PPIC, FEBUI, FEBUGM, Iluni FEBUI, Cafe Gamma in collaboration with World Bank with the topic Indonesia Economic Updates, Weathering the Global Economics Downturn. Before we start the lecture series, together we will hear the Indonesian National Anthem, Indonesia Raya. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand up.
Indonesia
Ladies and gentlemen, you are invited to return to your seats. You're all participants, ladies and gentlemen. To start our agenda today, together we will hear a welcoming speech from the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. For Mr. Teguh Dartanto, PhD, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Teguh Dartanto, Dean of Economic and Business Universitas Indonesia. I'm really sorry cannot attend this very valuable conference lecture series in person, but I try my best to give the welcome remark using the online. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Your Excellency, Mr. Wael Mansur, World Bank Senior Economist for the Macroeconomic Trade Investment and General Practice Group. Your Excellency, Mr. Habib from the World Bank's Jakarta office. Your Excellency, Bapak Taufan Roto Rasiko, Vice Chairman of the PPIC. Your Excellency, Bu Alexandra Askandar, Vice President, Director of Bank Mandiri and the Chairwoman of Iluni FEBUI. Your Excellency, Mr. Lars Christian Muller, General Practice Manager for Macro Trade and Investment at the World Bank. Dr. Arifi Bisono Lubis, the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Business Universitas Indonesia. Our senior colleague from the PPIC, Universitas Gadjah Mada, from the FEBUI, our Iluni FEBUI, Cafe Gamma, and from the World Bank. Student and researcher FEBUI and FEBUGM, all participants offline and online, ladies and gentlemen. A good afternoon to all distinguished speakers and participants here at our auditorium of FEBUI and those who join us online. To His Excellency, Mr. Lars Christian Muller, welcome to Indonesia. I hope we all are blessed with health, optimism, and hope as we start for the hybrid seminar and discussion. I'm honored to welcome you all to the PPIC International Lecture Series. This is the collaborations between two big universities, FEBUI, Faculty of Economics and Business Universitas Indonesia, and Gadjah Mada, and in collaboration with both alumni association. Today's discussion is our third lecture series within this, the third lecture series. We take the important theme of the weathering global economic downturns. As we discuss the main finding of the economic update within the recently published Indonesian Economic Prospect Report. The hybrid seminar came to fruition through the hard work and collaborations between Ikatan Sarjana Ekonomi Indonesia, the Indonesia Economic Association, FEBUI, FEBUGM, Alumni Association of FEBUI, and Cafe Gamma, Alumni Association of the FEB Gadjah Mada University, and also in the collaboration with the World Bank. The aim of this webinar is to bring together experts and economists from this institution to come together in order to discuss development within the Indonesian economy, how our economy is progressing, and how policy, particularly macroeconomics policy, has responded to the challenges we are facing today. As we know that Indonesia is the global condition is downturn, and maybe soon will also transmit it to the Indonesian economy. The key topics we will cover today is pinpoint challenges in the global economy that we are facing, discover whether the challenges Indonesia is facing converge or diverge from these global trends before outlining the policy implication. And the most importantly, analyzing the key factor needed to strengthen Indonesia's recovery from the economic shock we have been facing. In example, the prolonged impact of the COVID-19, the impact of the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and many other global challenges. Distinguished colleagues and participants, COVID-19 continues to impact economies around the world, coupled with other global challenges. This has contributed to the level of the volatility within our economy, significantly impacting economic growth, particularly when the pandemic first hit our nation. We have now been through nearly 3 years of the pandemic, and our economy has started to strengthen, but we know that the global economy is downturn, and maybe Indonesian economy also affected by this condition. The key finding within the June 2020 report confirmed that our economy has started to accelerate at the end of 2021, and that momentum has continued to grow as we enter 2022. The challenging global environment has, however, led to increased pressure due to the rising price of energy and food and tightening the external finance. As an example, due to the global supply chain challenges, within the recent month, we experienced increase in the price of the cooking oil, which also led to the increase in the food prices. Although the price of the cooking oil has now started to stabilize, these prices increase lead to the need for responsive social protection buffer to support poor and the near poor families. Despite facing these challenges, the IEP report found that our budget deficit has started to narrow in 2021, and that our economy is still projected to accelerate in the coming years, even though there are still many challenges. As the pandemic and the effect of the global challenges continue to unfold, actions still need to be taken to support the government effort in mitigating this possible adverse impact to our economy. We hope that through this discussion today, we may learn from our expert speaker on how best to support Indonesia build back better and emerge strong from these challenges. Once again, a very warm welcome to our expert speaker today and to our all audience in person in FEBUI and also in online. We are looking forward to a fruitful discussion and enjoy the seminar. I'm really sorry that I could not attend in person in Depok, because we have like annual meeting of the Association of Economics Department in Indonesia, and I'm also one of the advisory board and former chair of the association. I'm really sorry for this, but I hope that today the discussion will provide us an insightful knowledge, insightful policy for the next how to deal the challenges. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be with us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Teguh, for the welcoming speech. Now we are moving to the next agenda. Together, we will hear an opening speech from the Vice President Director of Bank Mandiri and Chairwoman of ILUNI FEBUI. For Mrs. Alexandra Askandar, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Yang kami hormati Dekan FEBUI, Bapak Teguh Dartanto, Vice Chairman dari PPIC International Affairs, Bapak Taufan Eko Nugroho Roto Rasiko, Good afternoon, our honored speakers, Manager Macroeconomic Trade and Investment Global Practice East Asia and Pacific of World Bank, Mr. Lars Christian Moller, and Senior Economist Macroeconomic Trade and Investment Global Practice of World Bank, Mr. Wael Mansur, serta rekan-rekan sivitas akademika FEB UI, FEB UGM, dan para peserta acara siang hari ini. Puji syukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Esa, karena atas karunia-Nya siang ini kita semua dapat berkumpul bersama dalam keadaan sehat walafiat. Pertama-tama izinkan saya menyampaikan apresiasi atas terselenggaranya International Lecture Series 3 PPIC sebagai bentuk implementasi program kerjasama antara FEB UI, FEB UGM, ILUNI FEB UI, dan KP Gama. Semoga kolaborasi strategis ini terus berlanjut dan melahirkan banyak manfaat ke depannya. Also, I would like to show my highest appreciation to Mr. Lars Christian Moller and Mr. Wael Mansur for sharing with us this afternoon. I hope that this would be a fruitful and impactful discussion, especially for all participants. Sebagai pembuka dari diskusi kita siang ini, izinkan saya menyampaikan latar belakang topik diskusi ini, yaitu Indonesia Economic Update, Weathering the Global Economic Downturn. Bapak, Ibu, dan rekan-rekan sekalian, selepas kuartal 3 tahun ini, perekonomian Indonesia masih mencatatkan kinerja yang cukup baik. Hal ini terlihat dari leading indicators ekonomi domestik di sepanjang kuartal 3 seperti Retail Sales Index dan Purchasing Manager Index serta indeks dari Bank Mandiri, yaitu Mandiri Spending Index yang merefleksikan perekonomian Indonesia berjalan cukup baik dan bertumbuh secara year on year. Meskipun demikian, memasuki kuartal 3, perekonomian Indonesia menghadapi tantangan yang semakin besar. Selain kenaikan inflasi dalam negeri, ancaman risiko global juga semakin kuat akibat gejolak ekonomi dan geopolitik dunia. Menilik kejadian geopolitik serta kejadian-kejadian tak terduga lainnya pada masyarakat global beberapa waktu ini, tentunya kita harus mempersiapkan langkah-langkah strategis untuk menjaga perekonomian Indonesia agar tetap kokoh ke depannya, terutama dalam menghadapi tantangan yang muncul baik di dalam maupun di luar negeri. Bapak, Ibu, dan rekan-rekan sekalian, menyambung hal tersebut telah hadir di tengah kita para pembicara dari World Bank yang akan melihat lebih mendalam isu Global Economic Downturn, respon kebijakan ekonomi pemerintah global, serta dampak dan langkah antisipasi bagi perekonomian Indonesia. Tentunya diskusi hari ini akan sangat bermanfaat bagi kita semua, terutama dalam perumusan kebijakan dan strategi bisnis ke depan ataupun sebagai pembelajaran. Demikian yang dapat saya sampaikan. Selamat mengikuti rangkaian acara hari ini. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Alexandra, for the opening speech. Ladies and gentlemen, to lead the next session, we kindly invite the moderator to this event, Mrs. Rizky Nauli Siregar, PhD. Dr. Siregar is an international trade economist and development economist. She obtained her PhD in economics from the University of California, Davis in 2021. She currently serves as a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of International Economic Policy at the University of Mainz. Without further ado, Mrs. Rizky Nauli Siregar, PhD, floor is yours.
Really, I'm not good in technology, but now it works. Thank you so much, everyone. Rahim, thank you for coming, and thank you for many audiences that join us online. So we're going to start soon, and without further ado, let me invite prominent economists that will share the Indonesian updates and some Asia Pacific updates. So first, we would like to welcome Dr. Lars Christian Moller. Dr. Moller is the World Bank Macroeconomic Trade and Investment General Practice Manager at the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. And second, we would like to welcome Dr. Wael Mansur, World Bank Senior Economics at the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice. Please join us, me on stage. And let's have a warm-up welcome. So for the first, I think we will use the, right? Itu udah nyala kan? Okay, to start our lecture today, we will have Dr. Moller to brief us the current economic condition, not only in Indonesia, but also in the region. Before that, let me introduce Dr. Moller to everyone in here in the audience. So Dr. Moller is a manager at the Macroeconomic Trade and Investment Global Practice in the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. He oversees the work of 36 staff covering 18 countries in Southeast Asia. He joined the bank as the young professional in 2005 and has worked in different managerial and country economics assignments in Latin America and Africa. Previous assignments include MTI manager in Africa, lead economist for the Andean countries, and EFI program leader for Ethiopia. His academic work spans a broad range of economic policy topics published in leading development journals and World Bank reports. He's a Danish national. Dr. Moller holds a PhD in economics from Nottingham, an MA in development studies from East Anglia, as well as MSc and BSc economics degrees from Copenhagen. So without further ado, please let Dr. Moller to start the presentation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great honor for me to be here today to speak to you, and thank you very much for the universities for inviting us. Let me get straight to our topic today. So I'm going to give a presentation about the global headwinds and about whether East Asia and Pacific can sustain the current process of recovery. And after that, my colleague Dr. Wael Mansur will focus on Indonesia. I will give more of a global context and a regional context. So I always think it's a good idea to summarize in one slide the points that I'm going to make. So in case you want to decide when to pay attention and when to look at your phones, this is the time where you pay attention. So I'm going to talk about three key points in the presentation. The first one is that the deteriorating global growth prospects, coupled with rising inflation and tighter finance, raise the risk of a global recession in 2023. Second point is that the EAP region is projected to grow faster with lower inflation than other regions of the world. But within the East Asia region, there are different paces of recovery. And the third one, looking ahead, there are basically three impediments to growth in the region. I'm going to talk about deceleration, debt, and distortions. I think I'll control it, right? Oh, this is not working. Let's see. Okay, slide 4, great. So global growth is expected to decline from 5.7% in 2021 to 2.9% in 2022, broadly as expected. But in 2023, global growth is significantly lower than what we expected when we last did our projections in June, by at least 1 percentage point. and our 2023 projections are likely to get downgraded in the near future in light of developments. This is due to major downgrades in the US, Euro area, and to some extent China, and hence weaker outlook for global trade, and also tighter than expected global financial conditions. So growth in emerging market and developing economies in 2022 has been downgraded to 3.4%, as negative spillovers from the invasion of Ukraine more than offset any near-term boost to some commodity exporters from higher energy prices. Indonesia is expected to grow faster than emerging markets in 2022 and also over the medium term. So that's the left-hand side graph that I spoke to. On the right-hand side, we look at the inflation. Many countries are targeting inflation, but inflation is above targeting in the vast majority of advanced economy. In fact, in all inflation targeting advanced economies, we now have above target inflation. And also in the emerging market, about 87% of countries actually are overshooting their targets. This is particularly since the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And as you know, in Indonesia, we are also now above the Bank Indonesia target of 4%, and we've been there for a couple of months, although core inflation remains within the target band. Next slide, please. So this slide shows that encouragingly, East Asia is faring much better than the rest of the region. And the question is why? So when you look at the graph, it might be a bit overwhelming, but on the first axis you have inflation, on the second axis you have GDP growth. And you really want to be in the top left-hand corner with high growth and low inflation. And that's where most East Asian countries are, including Indonesia. The rest of the world is facing currently either risk of stagflation or stagflation. But East Asia is different. And the question is, why is East Asia doing so much better? I will offer four factors, and we can also discuss more. The first is a set of structural factors. So in general, there's a higher potential growth rate in East Asia. That you can see in the historical data. And also it arises from the fact that it has higher productivity growth and also higher investment levels than in other regions. And also in terms of structural factors, when you look at why is inflation so low, well, in East Asia, rice is an important part of the consumer basket, much less so than wheat. And rice prices have been increasing less than wheat prices. So those are some of the structural factors why East Asia is not experiencing stagflation yet. Then there are some cyclical factors which relate to a belated recovery and some economic slack in East Asia. And then there are some policy factors, which is basically about how East Asia has had a more measured policy response and a good track record of prudent economic management. And also some policy decisions to limit the pass-through from high international prices. Domestic prices are often regulated, and there's limited pass-through to protect consumers. And then finally, why is East Asia doing better? Well, in terms of the Ukraine shock, it's generally less affected than other regions with less direct impact. Next slide, please. So if you look at this graph, you'll see the growth projections for China and for the East Asia region and for other countries in the Pacific. And you will notice, for instance, that China growth is projected only at 2.8% this year, compared to much higher levels in previous years. And East Asia, without China, is growing much faster at 5.3%. So this is an important development. Basically, what's happening is that in China, the outlook has flipped. And after strong growth in 2021, the continued use of the zero COVID approach using public health measures to contain local outbreaks has disrupted industrial and services production, domestic sales, and exports. So if you decompose growth from the demand side and you look at different countries in the region, the question is, what is driving the recovery. And basically it's private consumption, which are the red bars. So if you see a lot of red in the graph, that's private consumption. And the other demand side component that's driving growth are exports, and you can see them in orange. So those are the factors that drive growth. And we would say that lifting global mobility, accelerating vaccination program, and the decision to live with COVID-19 have released pent-up demand, leading to a surge in private consumption, which drove the recovery in most of East Asia outside China. However, private consumption has contributed very little to growth in China so far, as strict mobility restrictions remain in place. The recovery was also supported by exports of both goods and services, and this comes from both commodity exports, as global commodity prices reach new peaks, and manufacturing exports, as global supply chain bottlenecks slightly improved. So looking again at China and a zero COVID-19 approach, which uses mass testing and targeted mobility restrictions, which are aimed at containing the outbreak of the disease. Available measures of the stringency of COVID-related restrictions show a divergence between China and the rest of the region. Global mobility restrictions have gone down on average since the beginning of last year, while the region has only started to lower its restrictions in the last quarter of 2021. Meanwhile, in China, current mobility restrictions is broadly the same as last year. As you can see in the right-hand side graph, these restrictions in China disrupt supply chains, industrial and services production, domestic sales, and exports. And despite returning to the pre-pandemic levels, most high-frequency indicators show lower levels compared to last year's trend. So in this slide, we're basically looking at how slowing global growth will negatively affect growth in the region in 2023. And you will already see when you study the graph more carefully that we have made substantial downgrades, especially for US growth and EU growth. Whereas in Indonesia, we still are more or less holding the fortress and not downgrading too much yet. Among the factors posing risk to sustainable growth in the region is the global economic slowdown. Growth projections for large economies have been downgraded in the face of recent developments, but the downgrades are smaller in ASEAN countries, including Indonesia. Global economic forecasts have been gloomy, and shock in the global economy would impact EAP countries through trade, which is likely to depress demand for the region's export of manufactured goods and commodities if they were to materialize. It would also affect financial flows, including FDI inflows. This would hurt domestic investment and productivity growth over the medium term. The slowdown in major economies could shave more than 1% point off the growth of major economies, and slowdown in China could shave off by 0.8 percentage points in Malaysia, while it could cut up to 0.6% growth in Indonesia. So basically the left-hand slides are our actual projections. The right-hand graph are simulations as to how vulnerable a country like Indonesia, but also Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia would be to an unanticipated economic shock. And I think some of those shocks are materializing right now. And I think, going ahead in the coming months, we are most likely to see some downgrades at our global projections and our regional projections, and possibly also the Indonesia projections. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is about how increasing interest rates are leading to capital outflows and currency depreciation in East Asian countries. So the second risk comes from rising prices and interest rate. Inflation abroad is provoking an increasing interest rate, inducing capital outflows and exchange rate depreciations in EAP countries. Total emerging market capital outflows due to the war in Ukraine and the global monetary tightening has so far exceeded that of the global financial crisis and the taper tantrum. So that's what you can see in the left-hand side graph. We are the blue. The blue is the current shock, and it's not as bad as COVID, but it's pretty bad compared to many major shocks that have happened in the past. And the capital outflows have also led to US dollar appreciation in general and depreciation in EAP countries' currency, particularly in Thailand and the Philippines. Indonesia has so far experienced slight depreciation in the last 2 years. Currency depreciation also warrants close monitoring, particularly to the countries with a large share of external debt, since it is raising the burden of servicing debt. So this is perhaps less relevant to Indonesia, but relevant to the region, which is that the burden of debt is increasing. Debt had already increased significantly in the region's economy since the pandemic began. As interest rates and exchange rates depreciate, the burden of debt and debt service is more likely to increase in countries that have a large share of debt at variable rates and are denominated in foreign currency. You can see Laos and Mongolia stand out in this respect because they were already struggling with high debt and have large shares of debt at variable rates and denominated in foreign currency. Growing debt service is straining the finances of government and firms in limiting spending on infrastructure, health, and education. This is one of my favorite slides. It shows that it basically on the left-hand side shows price controls. How what does it say? The percent of products with price controls, which is as high as 16% in MENA and also East Asia. These are the names of regions, so Middle East, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and ECA. So on the left-hand side, we see which countries use price controls a lot, and it's basically Middle East and East Asia. And then on the right-hand side, we look at countries where inflation is high. This is measuring inflation, and you can see that MENA and East Asia also have very low inflation, whereas ECA and LAC, which use less price controls, have higher inflation. So controls on prices of food and fuel supported by subsidies, they dampen inflation, helping households and businesses in the short term. East Asia is the second region with the highest number of products with price control, and as a result, average inflation remained lower than other regions with a smaller number of products with price control. But these price controls, they muddy price signals in a post-COVID world where resource flow need a clear direction. It also adds to existing policy distortions in EAP countries. And I'll finish my presentation by asking some questions, maybe questions for discussion. So these are the issues we're looking at when it comes to the global situation and the regional situation. So 4 questions. The first one is whether inflation pressures, will they mount and derail the private consumption recovery? That's one of the things we are watching. The second one is whether capital outflows will continue and to what extent currencies will depreciate further. The third question is whether the relatively stronger growth in the East Asia region can be sustained given the current global economic slowdown and finance tightening. And finally, how will the authorities respond in terms of monetary and fiscal policy with the potential risk of elevated inflation and global monetary tightening? And with that, I'll finish it off. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muller. That was a really brief with some hopes, with some challenges for the regions. Now we would like to hear how will Indonesia face, in particular, these challenging times. In order to do that, I would like to welcome Dr. Mansur to give us some briefing.
Thank you everyone. Before I start, I want to really thank the Faculty of Economics for hosting us, the Dean and the Vice Dean. You have been we're very honored to be here actually and to talk with the students of this department and also hear from you during the questions and answers session. So I'll talk a little bit in this presentation about Indonesia. And I'm here to convey 6 main messages. And these are messages that we have presented in our biannual report, the Indonesia Economic Prospects, which actually portrays the World Bank views on the economy and its prospects every 6 months. I hope you can download it and read it. Next slide. So I'm not going to dwell on the global economy and on the regional economy. I think my colleague Lars has explained all the risks. I just want to say one point here, is that the global economy is entering a phase of stagflation. But with stagflation, what is important is that it's a very challenging situation for policymakers, because how do you deal with it? What are the trade-offs? Do you go into expansionary policies to maintain growth, but at the same time create inflation? Or do you tighten the economy to reduce growth and try to instill some stability at the expense of growth? And these trade-offs are very important. And I think in Indonesia, these are the types of questions, while we are very far from stagflation, on the contrary, it's a growing economy, but these are the questions I think the policymaker is faced with. Next slide. Next one. So the second message I wanna say is that the global outlook that was presented and explained by my colleague poses risks for growth in Indonesia. Historically, global commodity price cycles, like the one we are experiencing now, have been positively associated with Indonesia's growth cycle. Why? Because rising coal and palm oil prices tended to boost private consumption, tended to create a positive terms of trade, where the current account balance turns into a surplus. The fiscal impact has been historically positive because of windfalls from those commodities. And so overall, historically, if we look at the previous trends, positive shocks coming from commodity had a positive impact on the overall macroeconomy of Indonesia. But and this is reflected in our projections, and we'll see our projections in a bit. But the current commodity price shock is a little bit different this time, and it's different because it comes amidst supply side pressures, overheating, growth slowdown, high debt levels, and it comes within all of these, and it comes in a period where prices of commodities are expected to remain high. For these reasons, we see that there are significant downside risks that are coming. Next. So let's look a little bit at our projections. So our baseline forecast, GDP is growing at 5.1% in 2022-2023, rising from 5% and continuing at 5% in 2024. This is the first, if you look at the table and the decomposition chart. And this comes amidst, if you want, an acceleration of domestic consumption and investment, because the economy is going out of the pandemic. There are pent-up demand that is coming, that is being released. But these global inflationary pressures are expected to bring some deceleration to consumption, as more and more external prices are passed through into the domestic ones. And we see inflation actually surpassing Bank of Indonesia target of 4%. And we are expecting that in the next 2 years, it will remain at a high level. In fact, most of this inflation is coming because of what we call cost push factors. So basically it's imported inflation with the high fuel and food prices. On the external front, I think the financing conditions globally are becoming tighter. External pressure is building up, so it's more expensive to go and borrow on international markets. And because the Fed has been raising interest rate, Indonesia have seen some capital outflows. Indonesia and the rest of the emerging markets have seen capital outflows out of Indonesia, out of emerging markets, and towards the US, the US in particular. But at the same time, the current account is expected to pose a surplus because of those windfalls, those exports of commodity, which means lower external financing needs. So that's the first buffer that Indonesia has. And again, reserves, foreign currency reserves at the central bank remain at an adequate level above 6 months of imports and short-term obligation. So external vulnerabilities are moderate for now, but they are building up. They are building up because the external risks are building up, and because of the global economic environment. So a global slowdown or a slowdown in China could have implications, for example, on Indonesia as being one of the important trade partners, or this push on inflation, which decelerates the economy, or because, when you have a lot of inflationary pressure, you need to stimulate probably the subsidies, and you relocate some of the fiscal spending away from pro-growth programs towards more subsidy to maintain prices down. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But overall, this growth, these what we call downside risks that are coming from the global environment, if you want, could shave off around 0.5, 0.6% of growth if they materialize. Next slide. So the third point is that there was a short-term relief to the economy that were provided by the energy subsidies, but the case of reforming this subsidy is strong. And this is the first trade-off, if you want, that the policymaker is faced. One is that, we know that energy subsidies typically help in the short run contain inflation. They put a lid, if you want, on prices, on fuel prices, on gasoline prices, on electricity prices. In the short term, they do that. But, since global prices remain high, and as the economy grows, there's more mobility, with some of the exchange rate pressure also coming, this subsidy become less and less sustainable. Maintaining it for a long term becomes costly. So the authorities are faced with a situation. Do we keep a grip on inflation through this price, through this subsidy mechanism, or we will have to adjust? And actually, what we see from international experience is that the longer you wait, the more this adjustment becomes larger. And Indonesia has taken the decision to lift those fuel prices to relieve some of the pressure on the fiscal. And I think the one argument for this decision is that a lot of these energy subsidies are typically regressive, in the sense that richer households tend to use more fuel and electricity than poorer one. And actually this decision has generated subsidies were increasing. They've reached around 4.4% of GDP this year. And if the government did not take this decision, or by taking this decision, they have saved around 0.4% of GDP. This is the right-hand chart. If you see going forward, we have the subsidy removal decision from September versus the counterfactual, which is not removing the subsidy. And the question becomes, how do you use those savings and where do you use those savings? And this is part of the structural reform we're going to talk about. But this is the first trade-off that the government is faced with. We have a fiscal pressure from the subsidy. Do we maintain it and pay the cost, or we gradually remove it, although it would impact inflation and growth? However, it would generate fiscal savings that we could use in other development priorities. So this was the first trade-off. And the case for subsidies is that rather than subsidizing everyone, including the rich, why don't we channel some of those savings into targeting the more vulnerable population that are more in need of this support? That's through either targeted subsidies, through the social assistance fund. And this is the package that the Indonesian government has put forward, which cost around 0.1% of GDP. So a saving of 0.5, a package that is more targeted of 0.1, you have savings to do something else. Next. And this comes to the fourth, my fourth message is that assuming subsidies help contain short-term inflation or price pressures, this should allow a little bit of a breathing room for monetary policy to adjust gradually and return to a normalized situation. This is also important because the second trade-off is really, do we increase interest prices to respond to a growing inflation, or do we have the space to kind of keep those interests, keep this decision, those interests a little bit low, have cost of credit low, and then help businesses borrow? Next. I think the subsidies angle, why fiscal policy, this tightening of fiscal policy that happened, allowed a little bit the central bank not to have a dramatic increase in interest rates. So it gave it the leeway not to press the brake too fast, but do it gradually. But nevertheless, it is a big challenge as well for the Bank of Indonesia, because in previous historical episodes of where commodity prices were high, inflation expectations were not growing, in the sense that people, firms, businesses had in mind that this is a shock that would be temporary and then things will go back to normal. But now we see inflation expectations, or what people are expecting or businesses are expecting, are growing at a much faster rate, which means that the markets is expecting a protracted period for inflation. Moreover, before the Russia-Ukraine war, real interest rates was going down to zero. Now you see the big spike globally, and this comes after the decision of the US Federal Reserve to raise interest rate, and as inflation are coming up. So all the central banks in the region and globally have had to raise interest rates, including Indonesia. Now, the trade-off is, the question becomes, has Bank of Indonesia tightened too fast or not? Does Indonesia have some buffers before they could do that or not? I think this is a debatable question. I think Bank of Indonesia in its statement, this decision, always prioritizes stability. So I think this was a more a stability move faced with a rising core inflation, rising inflation expectation. It will have implication on growth. It will decelerate private credit because interests are expensive. So we are now at a situation where you have fiscal tightening from one side and monetary tightening from the other. Next. And before I go to this question is, and also because Bank of Indonesia is faced with a global environment, if they don't raise prices, would they still be able to attract capital inflows? Now, if you look more and more historically, that was a big challenge for Indonesia. In 2013, when the taper tantrum happened and the Fed raised the interest rate back then, you had a big capital outflow that has happened. But currently, when you look at other types of inflows coming to Indonesia, it's also a little bit different. You see more equity inflows, so inflows going into businesses, if you want, the stock exchange, as opposed to buying government debt, and you see more and more FDIs. In net terms, there's a negative outflow, so money in net terms have gone out, but not to the same extent that we've seen in 2013, because probably there are more trust in the Indonesian economy and then more investments coming in. And this is the type of things we want to see, the switching from short-term nature, buying government bonds, to more long-term commitment, buying equity and investments. Next. All right, so I'll go quickly because, this is about price controls that Lars was talking about. And a lot of governments, including Indonesia, when they were faced with this crisis, they moved towards imposing price controls or trade restrictions. And actually, 26 other countries have done that since the Ukraine-Russia war started. And, our research and experience at the World Bank shows that export restrictions do not necessarily help insulate the domestic market. On the contrary, they add distortions, and it has negative consequences. Restrictions could suppress prices for domestic producers. They could lead to hoarding effects. And then eventually you either decrease production or do not contribute to a decline in prices. And we've seen this episode, for example, with cooking oil, which because of the restrictions kind of disappeared from the supermarket shelf. So restrictive trade policies globally have not worked. And because they often end up doing the contrary of what you want to have. They don't help you reduce prices. Next. So this is the most important message we wanna come out with, is that Indonesia has been good at establishing a prudent macroeconomic policies, whether it's fiscal policies or monetary policies, and instill macroeconomic stability, and using those two policy tools to maintain stability and to help growth. And we've seen this firsthand during the pandemic, as the government intervened with a support package. They're doing it now as well. But it is now, these policies have been used extensively, and the margin of their impact is getting smaller and smaller. Why? Because we're now moving towards the need for more structural policies to have growth. Indonesia is growing at 5%, but Indonesia could well be growing at 8 and 9%. If the structural reform policies are being translated. And the government has been doing that. So there is there is a space for even larger growth with structural policies, structural reforms. What are those reforms? Next, we've identified 4 of them in this report. In the next report, we'll talk about others, but these are areas where the government has started doing work, and there's more deepening that needs to happen. One is that enabling the business environment for particularly small and medium enterprises to access credit, formalize, boost their productivity, engage more in green and digital transformation. The second area is implement trade policies that are targeted towards helping the economy become more competitive as opposed to controlling prices and production, which would help more growth and job creation. And this could include all the development that we're seeing or the government is talking about in terms of downstreaming industry. The third point, and is one of the more important, is really deepening the financial system by enhancing the supply and demand for resources, improving resource allocation, and ensuring stability. Indonesia has been very good in ensuring the stability of the financial sector, especially after the 97 crisis. But if you compare it to other emerging markets, big economies like Indonesia, the financial sector remains shallow. And that's problematic for growth because there's big savings out there that could, if you had a deeper financial system, could be translated into more credit to the private sector. And we're not talking only about banks, financial institutions, the whole financial intermediation route, which could be deepened. And the fourth one is really a structural reform that is related to taxes and boosting the tax to GDP ratio, because currently Indonesia has one of the lowest spending envelopes. And since this government, and rightly so, is very prudent on maintaining their fiscal target of 3% of GDP, it needs to raise spending. And to raise spending, it needs to raise taxation, domestic revenue mobilization, and use those additional revenues to improve the quality of public spending, which means spending on more pro-growth, pro-poor, human capital, infrastructure need. So structural fiscal reforms like the new tax harmonization law are essential. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I hope you can download our report, the World Bank Report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mansur, for a very enlightening session on Indonesian economy, extra with a lot of policy recommendations. So we will open the Q&A sessions for those coming to the auditorium today. Anyone who pose questions, we will have a special gifts. I know this is Faculty of Economics. We need to give some incentive. So there will be real incentive now. So anyone who has questions, please raise your hand. We will also invite audience online. If you have any questions, just click on the Q&A. I see some questions, and I think the organizer will convey it to us. So before that, and to probe some questions, I know some of you may need to think what to ask. Maybe I just give some questions first before we let the students here to ask. Okay, I'll give one question there after I give some questions to Lars and Wael. So first questions, if I may, maybe first, since we just covered questions on deepening financial sector, maybe this is first to Dr. Mansur. So how should a country like Indonesia with shallow financial market deepen the market while facing the trade-off of imposing strict regulation on safety financial services providers? while knowing this may limit competition in industry. What do you think we like? Is just for the first one, and then I'll give one questions to Oler, if I may. Meanwhile, so we know that there is this risk of stagflation, and everywhere in the world, central bank is increasing interest rates. We also see that from your presentation that in Indonesia as well as other East Asia Pacific regions will rely more on private consumption. So do you think this is why the region and also Indonesia will face a little bit less of risk from this higher interest rate economy? Or is there any particular recovery or any particular sector in the economy that will face a harder recovery in this type of stagflation risk, in this phenomenon of stagflation? Okay. So after this, we will ask one question from one side, and please, I'll invite more questions after this. Maybe answering first?
Yes, I mean, I'll be brief. Listen, I think the focus in the past years, in terms of the financial sector reforms was on really, macroprudential norms, ensuring the central bank and OJK has a good regulatory environment, monitoring risk. Was more of a risk approach, which is the good approach to start with. You don't want to end up in a financial crisis. What we're talking now about is more deeper reforms in terms of opening up the sector, allowing for more competition, not having concentration, for example, of lending to SOEs or other, allowing more products to come into the market. And I think there is a big reform drive happening with the financial omnibus law that could be a cornerstone to really launch this deepening effect, and this could release much money. When we look at, for example, I'm going to give an indicator. Credit to the private sector has been increasing in Indonesia. Deposits have also been increasing in Indonesia. But when you benchmark Indonesia to other countries, ASEAN countries or other G20 countries, which is really the benchmark of where Indonesia should be, you would see that as a share of the economy, as a share of the banking sector, it remains much smaller than others. So it's a regulatory aspect. It's about attracting more investment and going more into deeper reform. And again, the financial omnibus law is a cornerstone.
Okay, and to your question, I think I'd like to make some points about the strengths of the Indonesian economy. I'll talk about structural strengths and also macroeconomic management. So the first thing is to highlight and appreciate how Indonesia actually, during the COVID shock, how Indonesian policymakers took the opportunity of the crisis to implement reforms. I cover 18 countries in Asia, and Indonesia was by far the leader in terms of structural reforms over the last 2 years. And I wanted to mention 2 reforms that stood out for us to be really important to support the economy in the medium to long term, and reforms that were difficult to implement. The first one relates to the openness of the investment regime to allow more foreign direct investment into the country. That was really an important structural reform that will yield 0.1, 0.2% of extra growth every year from now on, once some of the implementation and legal challenges have been fully addressed. That was an important reform that we would have liked to see in many other countries in the region. And the Philippines did some in the retail sector. They opened up the retail sector, but Indonesia did it across a broad range of sectors. That was an important reform. The other reform that the government did was the tax reform, tax harmonization law, which amongst many things increased the harmonization, increased the VAT rate. Why is that important? Well, Indonesia collects relatively little in fiscal revenues, and as a result, can only spend so and so much on the government side, and that is not good So basically, Indonesia faces a long-term challenge of raising revenues much further than even after the reform, but it was an important step in the right direction. Those are a couple of structural reforms that really underpin the structural strengths of the economy. In terms of macroeconomic management, I also really want to appreciate how well the government has done that. Let me give an example of how to manage the fiscal side. So a couple of years ago, when the COVID crisis hit, spending had to go up to support firms and households, and tax revenues were plummeting because there was limited economic activity. And so fiscal deficits increased, debt started to rise. And it was a lot of policymakers were unsure of how to handle this. They were unsure on how to handle the need for a temporary expansion on the fiscal side without really knowing how large that expansion should be and for how long it would take. The Indonesian government decided to anchor its own policies and everyone's expectations in a firm target of returning to the 3% fiscal deficits by 2023. And I was very pleased to see the government approving a budget very recently with a 2.8% fiscal deficit for 2023. That helps tremendously in anchoring expectations and ensuring that everyone has confidence that the fiscal is under control, and that is attractive to investors, helps reduce the cost of borrowing for the government. Those are some of the decisions the government have made to help strengthen the economy, and which helps explain also why we're not seeing stagflation in Indonesia.
Very comprehensive answers. So let me invite the audience over there. Please kindly use your name and maybe from which faculty or department, or you were, if you're no longer a student.
I check. So good afternoon, Mr. Mansour and Mr. Moller, and everyone in the audience. My name is Ariel Baskara Hosansi Hombing I'm a second year economics student here at FEBUI. So I'm really interested in trade and investment, and I'm sure Mr. Moller and Mr. Mansour is more than qualified to answer this question. My question is, what reforms do we need to make on or implement on trade and investment to make Indonesia or maybe other countries less prone to all the global dynamics and conflicts going on right now? Because as we maybe know, there are lots of global dynamics happening, like the Russia-Ukraine war, China and Taiwan, and maybe the US-China trade war, and so on. So what reforms do we need to make to ensure that we're not really prone and we're resilient against these conflicts? Because as you know, these conflicts also take a toll on our social economic aspects, on our people. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
There are more questions from the audience?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Fatia I'm master's student from University of Indonesia. Last night I'm just have past monetary policy. Then we are talking about the peace in South Korea, and also this morning I read a paper about the Mexican finance minister who indicate. Then what I want to ask is because of we are Indonesia in one basket with the Middle Mexico, India, South Korea, and also Turkey, and the other three countries have a lot of problem like trade deficit and also the inflations, and they cannot control them. And what I want to ask is there any contagious effect to us for Indonesia and from the view from the World Bank. That's my point. For the two questions.
Okay, let me address the first question. I don't know if you could take the second. Yeah. So very good questions, and it's great you introduce yourself and explain that in which year you are and what you're studying at the moment. I appreciate that because it also brings my thoughts back to when I was sitting at the benches and thinking about economics for the very first time sometimes, right? So when you ask about what trade reforms and what investment reforms does Indonesia need, it brings me back to those days. I still remember, being a bit surprised when our lecturer in international economics told us that actually the benefits of trades are not exports, but it's imports. And he explained it back then with looking at consumer surplus and how imported goods expand the range of consumption possibilities. And at the end of the day, consumers are those that maximize welfare. Firms maximize profits, but consumers maximize welfare, and social welfare is the sum of profit and the consumer surplus. And so that was like a big revelation. So it kind of flicked the switch in my head away from a mercantilist mindset towards a free trade mindset. Since then, there are many other arguments in favor of trade that one comes across. But I think I sometimes recognize a tendency in public discussion to focus more of the benefits of having a large export base and a large trade surplus. And those ideas are actually not economically sound. And I hope as students and when you graduate, you can help educate people around you to make sure that they understand that you don't necessarily want to maximize a current account surplus. You can perfectly well have a large current account deficit as long as it's financed well and there are no risks around that financing, especially if it's financed with foreign direct investment. You can actually experience the rapid growth that Mansour was mentioning earlier, the rapid growth that Indonesia needs. Indonesia trades incredibly little with the rest of the world. So when you look at the sum of exports and imports, it's very low compared to other regions. It's been very low over a long period of time. When you get into more sophisticated economics and you look at some of the drivers of growth and you start running econometric cross-country regressions, you would know that it's a robust relationship between trade openness and economic growth. So this is a growth driver that Indonesia is missing out on. So if Indonesia wants to grow at 7, 8, 9% instead of 5 and become a high-income country eventually, it would need to expand both exports and also imports. Imports are also critical as an input to all the industries that export. So if you want to maximize exports, you also have to look at what exporters need. They need imports of goods, intermediate goods, capital goods. They need imports of services. And if those services are not available at a high quality domestically, it hurts Indonesia's competitiveness. But that would be a few things to reflect on in terms of trade reforms that Indonesia could think about.
So basically, to answer your question, is really about the contagious effects that are coming from the global economy. And there are 3 channels in my mind. I mean, I will organize them in 3 channels. One, there's global growth slowdown. That, a slowdown in global growth means less demand for Indonesian goods and services or commodities. And then there's this there's this direct trade impact. Now, my colleague has explained that, trade could be larger, so probably this direct effect is not as large as the other 2. So the second is global inflation, and this is where we see, high oil prices, high food prices, so this imported inflation that is coming that would affect either directly consumers by raising prices and slowing down consumption, or it would affect public spending if the government decides to subsidize. But in all cases, it has a cost. The third one is financing, external financing. We've seen that emerging markets like Indonesia are very volatile in terms of the decision that is made globally by, for example, the Fed. The Fed has raised the interest rate by 100 basis points, which triggered automatically capital flights, because investors will say, okay, I'll go and put my money and get more higher returns now in the US, so let me invest or buy US debt. This is what Indonesia has faced, Mexico has faced, South Korea has faced, everyone has faced. But what we're saying is the following, is that how do you mitigate those and make those impact less? One is by doing what the Indonesian government did in terms of macroeconomic stability and building buffers. Indonesia has buffers. It has high reserves, foreign currency reserves to interfere if they need to. They also have low debt to GDP, which means if they want to intervene and put a package of support for businesses or for household, they can do that. They did that in the crisis. And in terms of financing, this is where the structural reform agenda comes in. That when you do structural reforms, then you start attracting inflows, foreign inflows that are more long-term, that they want to invest in projects as opposed to only in debt. And this is, for example, where countries like Korea, Mexico has been very good in attracting. And this is what Indonesia could do, and is actually. So really, it's about maintaining macroeconomic stability to have the buffers needed to intervene. That's the first route. And second route, continue to do structural reforms so that you attract more foreign currency inflows into projects and investments that are more longer term and produce higher job and employment opportunities.
Let's switch to our online audience. Questions? Or one question at least. Would you mind to put it up in our... I can read it. That's some that we have some questions. So, but it up here. One question. Yeah. Okay. So let me read one of the questions. So G20 signed the agreement to reduce the fossil fuel usage for clean energy in the near future. But the cost to generate energy outside from coal and fossil fuel, such as from solar cell, wind power, water dam, electricity, etc., require huge investment, which Indonesia doesn't have ready in near future. Instead, our coal reserve or deposit is still abundant. What do you think? Will Indonesia follow as Europe countries also go back to coal energy for survival on current years where Ukraine war with Russia, or will we continue reducing coal? I think that's the implied questions. Yeah, that's the first question. There is one more question. The government says that Indonesia will become high-income country in 2045, 100 years after our independence. How can Indonesia achieve this goal? I have one more question too, if I may, because it's related to the energy questions. So since Lars just was being nostalgic of being a student, I just remember the first time I was a student in this university. I was sitting here as the first year student, and the general lecture was given by Minister Sri Mulyani at that time. It was 2005, and it was like way back. I'm quite old, but he was explaining to us about the increase in fuel prices as well. So this problem or these challenges in reducing energy subsidy it's actually not something new, and we have been facing it since like 2005 when I was an undergrad student even. So since I think Dr. Mansur mentions that Indonesia did some short-term relief on energy subsidies, but need for stronger reform. Would you mind to provide maybe some concrete examples of what kind of reforms that we can do in order to reduce our energy subsidy burden?
So I'm going to invite our colleague Habib Rab to help us answer this question, and I do that because I know he has spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. Habib Rab is the World Bank's lead economist, and he's worked a lot in the area of green growth and green transition. And I think he would be very well placed to cover several of these questions. So if it's okay with you, we'll pass the floor to Habib Rab.
Thank you very much, Lars. So on this question regarding the transition away from coal and towards renewable energy, I think the premise of the question is that given that Indonesia has significant endowments of coal resources, why should it not use those coal resources in order to drive economic growth? And why should it transition away from that and investment into areas where it would need to crowd in investment into areas where it may not necessarily have a comparative? And the reason is that even though in the short term, the coal resources can be used to accelerate economic growth, over the longer term, the emissions that model pursues can actually harm economic growth because it can reduce Indonesia's adaptation capabilities against climate change. Now, of course, there needs to be a transition. You can't go immediately from coal into renewable energy resources. And that transition needs to take account of what sort of disruption this transition might cause, what sort of investments might be needed. Yes. This is the coal producers. What sort of investments might be needed in order to achieve that transition? And our own modeling exercises suggest that with the proposed transition that the government has set out, which is to achieve net zero by 2050, 2060, you could achieve both reduction in carbon emissions by moving away from coal-based electricity production and accelerate economic growth. And the reason being is that if you move towards renewable energy, that will also require new investments into the economy. It might also enable firms to become more energy efficient over the transition period as they try to reduce emissions. And also, of course, energy is one area, but the land-based sector is the other one as well. So it's not just coal, but also reducing deforestation and land-based. So that's what I would say on the coal-based issue, the coal transition. On the fuel subsidy reform, it's a good question. I think on the positive side, over the long term, if you look at the last 20 years, there has been a gradual reduction in fossil fuel subsidies. In particular, when in 2015, when oil prices had declined sharply, there was that reform in order to reduce subsidies. But then it started to increase again when energy prices started to rise. Of course, implementing these reforms when energy prices are very high is very difficult. So the challenge then is that as energy prices start to normalize, and the authorities know this already, there needs to be a decision to say that the default will not be to subsidize fuel prices. The default will be that market prices will be charged, and that the savings that are generated from the reduction in fuel-based subsidies are rechanneled to the households that are most negatively impacted, so the bottom 40%. Now that is not as easy as it sounds, because it also requires a lot of reforms in the social protection system, so ensuring that registries of households are updated so that we can target the subsidies much better to those households. So it needs to be a comprehensive package which looks at both not targeting the product, so electricity and fuel, but rather targeting the households, which requires reforms to the social protection system. Thank you very much.
Very comprehensive. That we managed to stay on when the fuel price goes down, and then do actual reform. Please, the next question.
But I wanted to add the point. I mean, I wasn't as studious as Lars in my second year at the university. I was actually protesting with the student unions against fuel subsidy. No, but I completely agree with what Habib is saying. But there's also the other side of the coin, is what do you do with those savings? And this is what is important. The aspect that Habib talked about is very correct. You have to go to a market-based formula for determining fossil fuel prices, fuel, electricity, etc., and then target the household. But what do you do with the savings? If you re-inject those savings into pro-growth programs, public that boosts the competitiveness of the economy, that boosts the infrastructure of the economy, and create jobs, it would improve income for labor. Then the subsidy won't become would have even higher economic returns. Because not only would you have targeted directly the poor, but you would have also indirectly through the growth channel targeted everyone, especially the middle class. So there's also this aspect, and I think this is where the Minister of Finance has been very clever in looking at what do we do with
I think all students here can get like many ideas for their bachelor thesis, at least tax reform, social protection reform, energy subsidy reform. May I open again the question maybe here for audience that come to the auditorium? Any questions, please raise your hand. Oh, one over here. Also the next one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is Fajar from undergraduate program in Department of Economics FEBUI. Thank you for the insight in current condition of global and Indonesian economy. Indonesia have a history of fighting inflation and depreciation of currency when we face a taper tantrum phenomenon. My question is, what is the difference between current condition and the taper tantrum in 2013? And in terms of three risks of growth that Mr. Lars explained before, deceleration, debt, and distortion. And also Indonesian government already implement cut full subsidy that increase our expected inflation. And as response, Central Bank of Indonesia doing a normalization by increasing the interest rate. My question is, are the policy that government and central bank already enough to face the three risks? And for the next, what kind of policy mix that Indonesia must implement in order to face the three risks of growth? Since we know that for doing the structural reform that Mr. Weil explained before, we must solve some problem and challenge first, and in the same time, we face political consolidation for the reform agenda. Okay, thank you.
Lecture. I think my question is the same as his. So.
Any more questions? more question maybe from the left or the right, the middle? Okay, I add one more question about finance, if I may. So I don't know whether you've heard about this phenomenon of influencers of financial services. So maybe I think Kim Kardashian even. But in terms of, we know that we would like to deepen financial systems, and one of the messenger of promoting financial services is actually now influencers. So in terms of protecting consumers, how could we protect consumers from misleading information, including from the so-called influencers or unlicensed financial services providers, especially as we have seen a lot of cases of scams? But do you think in this situation of lots of misleading information, how can we still promote financial opening and build trust to the public?
Let me start. I think, I'm new to the Indonesia program, so I will give it to my colleague, a graduate of the University of Indonesia, my colleague Indira Hapsbury, who's actually did a lot of comparisons on when the taper tantrum was here and what's the difference. So maybe Indira, you want to answer this question?
Good afternoon, everyone. Are here and online. So maybe I'll just answer the questions on the taper tantrum and the difference of what Indonesia is now and between now and the taper tantrum. So we have similar sort of background where the Fed increase its interest rates, and there's a lot of capital outflows, and then there's also global financial vulnerability and volatility happened in the taper tantrum and also now. But maybe just like 2 or 3 points that that marks a significant difference between difference in Indonesia between the taper tantrum and now. First one is that Indonesia now has a more sound macro developments policy. So first, debt is not that, debt is declining actually. External financing is declining, where Indonesia needs to pay its debt, and that the financing and where it depends on the currency, right? And in the past, we also see there's a quite significant share of non-foreign ownership in Indonesian external debt, while now that share is already declining, especially since the COVID pandemic. So from around 34-35%, I think it's now below 20%, maybe like around 15 or 16%. At the same time, like I said, external financing is declining. We have a current account surplus, and in the past we have a current account deficit, which we need to finance, which we need, foreign currency to pay this. Now we also have a good foreign reserves. That is, I think the last data from the Bank of Indonesia shows that we still have enough reserves to finance more than 6 months of imports and then government external debts. And I think those are the things that really makes a significant difference between Indonesia and now. So we know that currency is depreciating as well, but in terms of like volatility and how does the shock affect Indonesians' macro and fiscal condition is also different. So that is, I think, the questions, right? So yeah, I'll give it back to Lyle. Thank you.
So just on the question, and actually on the depreciation part, there is a big part that is not related to Indonesia. it's the US dollar that is appreciating now. It's like the US exporting its inflation to the world. So all currencies are depreciating very fast. On the question influencers and the financial sector, I'm not a big expert on both, either influencing or
Yeah, just very briefly, I think starting to become more familiar with all the scams that are out there in terms of the way that the financial sector can operate, the way they can lock in consumers who are completely unaware of what they have signed up for. So I think this is a question of building institutions, in particular building two types of institutions. One is consumer protection agencies, which are opportunities for citizens, and in this case consumers, to raise their complaints to some agency that's willing to listen to their complaints and can represent these consumers, especially if they are a large number of consumers, can raise more awareness with the authorities about potential scams that are out there. And the other thing is to increase financial sector regulation and supervisory authorities to make them more aware of what are the possibilities of traps and tricks that consumers can be led in, so that there's more protection. Because we do want access to finance, we do want financial intermediation, but we don't want pyramid schemes and frauds and consumer contracts that nobody understands, and then consumers end up with high interest payments and possible situations. I think that's how I would tackle it. Thanks.
Great. I think we have one more question online. Would you mind to put it up? Okay. Let me use there are two actually. Okay, so first question from Andy Junior. So if we observe that Ukraine's war did much damage to the world economic stability, an incoming warning from China, which will seize Taiwan, at least, do you think that will worsen the economy by 2027 to 2030 or so, especially for Southeast Asia region, including Indonesia? A bit of geopolitics.
No, those the top couple of questions. I don't know if you read both of them, but they're both on geopolitics. I think rather than going into the specifics of what those questions want to tease out, I think it's good to make a broader point, which is that the world economy is facing a lot of shocks. One shock after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And many of them unprecedented. The shock of COVID-19 was completely unprecedented. Only specialists really knew about it. Nobody could anticipate how a pandemic could spread so fast. It wasn't and cover such a large share of the globe, and for so long with such deep economic consequences. It was a big shock. I don't think many people had that on their radar screen. Specialists knew about it. There were regional outbreaks of similar diseases in East Asia, so there was a bit more awareness of it here, but it was a huge shock. And one of the biggest we have experienced post Second World War in terms of economic and social and human disaster globally. That was one big shock. A second type of shock is what these questions are related to, which is around geopolitics. I don't think anyone quite anticipated how the world international order is kind of dismantling, and it was a shock to see Russia invade Ukraine, and there's the geopolitics of that, but also this had huge economic consequences, which we have discussed in our presentations in terms of shock to supply of food. It turned out that this was the breadbasket of the world, and the prices went up, supply of food went down. there's hunger in different parts of the world. It's difficult to not associate that with the crisis. Nobody could anticipate that in response to the invasion of Ukraine, that the West would respond with unprecedented financial sector sanctions, effectively trying to lock out Russia from the global financial system, deep economic sanctions, but at the same time also it revealed how dependent Europe had become on Russian gas. And now nobody would have thought that Europe would ever be in a situation where we have to start rationing use of gas and energy, and there are fears about the winter. So a lot of shocks are happening. They're hurting growth globally. They're hurting trade flows. They have dramatic consequences for countries that are affected and for countries that are nearby. And these are huge, unprecedented geopolitical turns that we must all keep an eye on. And so those are very good questions that really reminds us that while we can talk about textbook economics, while we can think about the economy as a closed system, it really is not a closed system. It links with the environment, which is what my colleague Habib was discussing, and it links with geopolitics. And geopolitics is going to be more and more important for economic students to keep an eye on. Some of the discussions we're having at the World Bank with experts are really highlighting how we need to pay perhaps even more attention to geopolitics than we did in the past. Think about how the geopolitical events affect the economics.
From my perspective, the bottom line is if you have more macroeconomic buffers, you are more resilient to shock, geopolitical or other. And I think this is what Indonesia has witnessed so far. It has been more resilient because of this macroeconomic buffers. We have a saying in my country, I come from Lebanon, is that save your white coin for your black day. So save your white coin for your black day, and this is what macroeconomic buffers are: fiscal buffers, monetary buffers.
Great. Let's maybe close on that very hopeful note, and we do have some really good buffers so far, and hopefully we can continue to do so. Before I close the session, may I summarize some of the key points that we have learned today. First, the global economy is facing a risk of downturn with rising inflation, yet the East Asia regions projected to grow faster with lower inflation. This fast growth will be driven by private consumption and exports, while the challenges will be in navigating the economy, in facing capital outflows and currency depreciations. Indonesia, meanwhile, faces moderate external pressures. The current commodity prices shocks is quite different with the previous commodity price shocks. Internally, short-term relief on energy subsidies have been taken as well, but there is a strong case for reform. Lastly, to further improve the recovery, and reports have several policy recommendations on structural reforms. One, that Indonesia should enable business environments for especially micro and small medium enterprises, implement trade policies that boost competitiveness, deepen the financial system, and last but not least, implement structural reform together with tax reform. So with that, I think we have been very lucky to learn from both of you today, and thank you so much for all the audience who have participated. Those that have raised questions here in the audience in the offline session, please feel free to get your gifts in the registration desk. So thank you. I'll give the session back to the. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Rizky Nauli Siregar, and for all the speakers today, Mr. Lars Christian Moller and Mr. Wael Mansur. for giving such an informative and interesting presentation. For speakers and moderator, we kindly request that you remain within your seat. Because, ladies and gentlemen, before we close this international lecture series, we would like to hear closing remarks that will be delivered by the Chairman of PPIC International Cooperation and Chairman of BSBI. To Mr. Muhammad Edi Purnawan, time is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we heard a very great presentation on today's international lecture series number 3, a series of collaboration between FEBUI, FEBUKM, and then PPIC, as well as ILUNI, PPUI, and KPGAMA. This series becomes more and more firms, lectures, and the topics today is very relevant for the global challenge and also Indonesian reform for the structural economy. I enjoyed listen the presentation of the both presenters. As we know that the world economy now has just lost the momentum in the wake of Russia's war with Ukraine, which is dragging down the growth and putting additional upward pressures on the inflation and interest rate worldwide. And as central banks now across the world simultaneously hike interest rate, now they are all, I think, is hawkish, more hawkish, and this will make the world maybe edging toward the global recession in 2023. And a string of financial crises in the emerging economy and developing economy that I think would do them the lasting harm. Let me quote the World Bank Group President. According to World Bank Group President David Malpass recently, the global growth is slowing sharply, with a further slowing likely as more countries fall into recession. The deep concern is that this trend will persist with long-lasting consequences that are devastating the people and also the economy as well, especially in emerging economy and developing economy. The projection of the global growth now is at the modest level, and if there is no positive shocks during 2 days and maybe one semester ahead, then there will be a slowing down the economic growth further in 2023. And, you know, as already mentioned by the presenters, that politics comes into the arena. The Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were exploding 26th of September 2023. Although now it's becoming more settled, yeah, because of the supply of gas is not only coming from Russia, and also there are more pipelines going to the European economy. But according to the German's economy minister, he just accused the US and other friendly gas supporters at states of the astronomical price for their supplies, suggesting that they were profiting from the fallout of the war in Ukraine. And it makes the inflation and also energy supplies skyrocketing in prices. And managing the energy crisis requires extraordinary efforts to secure the alternative supplies while ensuring all of the sectors in the economy are incentivized to reduce the demand. There is also an urgent need for the governments to accelerate the investment in energy, also in energy security, and also invest in the green transition. As you know that the annual growth of the GDP is projected to slowing down to around 0.5% in the United States of America in 2023 and 1/4 in the European area, and also because of the risk of the deeper declines in the several European countries, European economies during these upcoming winters. You know that the substantial uncertainty about the economic outlook with a significant downside risk exists now, and it is materialized. This includes the possibility of further food and energy price spike, which could push many people into poverty, especially in the poor country, as well as the possibility of the gas shortage as winter is coming. And I think because of these challenging but also negative shocks from the world politics, from the world economy, then taken together, these shocks could reduce the economy to be in a very low state in 2023. But as an emerging economy, Indonesia is very optimistic, although Indonesia has to be very in a stance of precautionary to absorb the world economy, world environment, also as mentioned in the discussion on the geopolitics and also the geoeconomy, to support itself to survive in 2023. But we are very optimistic because we have plenty of resources in Indonesia, and we have food securities. Also, we have a gas, we have oil, although we have to be precaution about our expenditures on those kind of resources. The fiscal support, on the other hand, may have the cushion of the impact of high energy costs on household and companies, but should be concentrated on the most vulnerable and preserve incentive to reduce the energy consumption. Then Indonesia, by 2023, I think, from the fiscal side, the state budget that is able to maintain the flexibility on handling the economic disruption must be planned from now, which is often called the shock absorber, the fiscal shock absorber. As well as the Central Bank of Indonesia, I hope, will put much effort to have the economy which will be recover stronger after the COVID-19. I think I have to stop now. Thank you very much for FEB UI, Pak Teguh Dartanto, the Dean, with the good friends there in Depok. FEB UGM, Pak Didi Aryari, and friends in Bulak Sumur. Also Bu Sandra, the chairman of the Iluni FEB UI, and also Pak Peri Warjo, the Cafe Gama chairman, as well as the Bank Indonesia governors. Special thanks to keynote speaker Lars Christian Moller, manager macroeconomic trade and investment global practice East Asia and Pacific World Bank, and also the speaker, while Mansour, senior economist, macroeconomic trade and investment global practice World Bank. From the PPICI, we thank as well the attendees, which is, I think, give a very good question to the speaker, and also for the committee. I thank you very much. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for Mr. Edi Purnawan for the closing remarks. And now we would like to give token of appreciation for all the speakers. For that, we would like to invite our Vice Dean, Mr. Arif Wibisono Lubis, PhD, to present this to our speakers. Dr. Arif, please join us on the stage. Now we can take a photo together. We'll take a photo. Please, Ibu Dira and Mr. Happy to join the photo session. Okay, and now we are going to have a group photo with all the participants. So please, to all the speakers and also Pak Arif to take a place in front area of the participation. To all the participants, please stand up and maybe you can go to the front. Come closer to the front. One more. Okay, thank you so much everybody. May have a seat. Well, dear all participants, ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap up of the international series today. On behalf of FEBUI, I would like to apologize for any inconvenience that happened during this event. It's been a pleasure to host this event. I wish you all have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you so much. For those who asked a question offline today, don't forget to take your gift in registration area. Thank you.
Terima kasih ya.
Terima kasih Pak Edi, terima kasih Pak Arif dan teman-teman semua FEBUI. Terima kasih. Terima kasih Pak. Izin live.
Terima kasih.
The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders. Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, We are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Esmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Fakultas Economy and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FABUE has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as